U.S. President Joe Biden ordered his first military action on Thursday. He authorized retaliatory airstrikes against Iranian-backed militants in Syria who've been accused of firing rockets in Iraq. The U.S. says a handful of militants were killed in the airstrikes. The militants were targeted after they sent rockets raining down in repeated attacks like this one in Erbil on February 15th. A civilian contractor was killed after Thursday's retaliatory strikes. The U.S. Defense Secretary had this to say.
We're confident in the target that we went after. We know what we hit. And we're confident that that target was being used by the same Shia militia that conducted the strikes. And so you'll get more information in terms of the effects of the strike as time goes by. But I just wanted to make sure that, I gave you that viewpoint from me, that level of confidence that there is connectivity. And so we're very deliberate about our approach, as you would expect us to be.
And we begin our coverage with CNN's Oren Lieberman at the Pentagon.
The airstrike against a site in eastern Syria along the Iraq-Syria border is the first known military action under President Joe Biden. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said it was his recommendation and that Biden gave the final authorization for the strikes on Thursday morning. A U.S. official familiar with the strikes said up to a handful of militants were killed in that airstrike. And they come after a series of rocket attacks against U.S. and coalition forces operating in Iraq. First in Erbil about a week and a half ago, then in Balad Air Force Base just north of the city of Baghdad, and then the Green Zone in Baghdad itself. Austin said that part of the messaging here, and Pentagon spokesman John Kirby backed this up, was first that there will be a response to these rocket attacks, and second, to deter future rocket attacks. Austin made it clear that they're confident that it was Iranian-backed Shia militias that were operating in these sites that were struck by the U.S. Air Force, and it was those same militias responsible for the rocket attacks. Up until now, the U.S. hadn't attributed the rocket attacks to anyone, but now pinpointing it on Iranian-backed Shia militias and more broadly holding Iran responsible for the actions of its proxies in Syria and in Iraq. This comes at a crucial time for the Biden administration when it comes to Iran, as it tries to figure out what to do and how to work diplomatically about Iran's nuclear program, also signaling that it wants to broaden out the agreement to include Iran's ballistic missiles and Iran's actions in the region. Oren Lieberman, CNN at the Pentagon.
CNN's Ben Wiedemann is live this hour in Erbil, Iraq. So tell us more about the militia that was targeted here.
Well, specifically which ones aren't clear because there's really a myriad of these militias that are in one way or another affiliated with Iran that operate in many parts of Iraq, including that area on the other side of the border with between Iraq and Syria. Since the defeat of ISIS, a lot of these militias have taken up positions in northern Iraq around the city of Mosul, for instance, basically filling a vacuum that has been created by the defeat of ISIS, but the weakness of the central Iraqi government. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that the border between Iraq and Syria is fairly porous, and these militias are able to move back and forth over that border with relative impunity, because it's also important to keep in mind that these Iraqi militias have also fought alongside with the Syrian military in its war against its opponents. So it's a very complicated situation which the United States finds itself, as usual, as it has basically since the downfall of Saddam in 2003. Now, these militias during the war against ISIS sometimes were fighting in essentially parallel with the U.S. military against ISIS. Back in 2014 and 15, I in fact embedded with some of those militias for quite some time. But what we've seen since the defeat of ISIS, that they are finding themselves increasingly on opposite sides with the U.S. military. And of course, they are being blamed, for instance, for the repeated missile or mortar attacks on the Green Zone in Baghdad, where the U.S. embassy is located. And of course, here in Erbil on the 15th of February, More than a dozen rockets were fired at the airport, and some of them also landed in residential areas of the city. Kim?
So we heard that the strikes were across the border in Syria specifically to avoid any diplomatic headaches for the Iraqi government. So explain the dynamics here.
Well, as I said, it's complicated. The Iraqi government does include people who are affiliated with those militias. Therefore, it's better for the United States from that point of view to strike those Iraqi militias at their positions on the other side of the border with Syria. But at the end of the day, they are still, it's believed, Iraqi militias. And therefore, on paper, perhaps, among in the sort of the diplomatic niceties, no, they did not attack targets in Iraq, but they might have attacked Iraqi targets just on the other side of the border in Syria. So it may make a difference in diplomatic terms, but in practical terms, it could have been a strike in Iraq. Kim?
All right. Thank you so much for that reporting there, Ben Wiedemann in Erbil. I want to cross over to London now and bring in CNN's international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson. So, Nick, this is just after the Biden administration opened the door to talks with Iran about the nuclear deal. Iran hadn't yet, responded to that invitation. So what effect could this have on the dialogue on the JCPOA?
I think at multiple levels, domestically in the United States, where there were fears perhaps by some that Biden was going to be soft on Iran, that his position to get back into those JCPOA, that nuclear deal talks, was one that had laid out to the Iranians that they don't have to change any of the things that they're currently doing that break that, and they're quite substantial, the things that they're doing that break that international nuclear deal. The United States will get back to the table with them before they have made those changes to talk about the way forward. So far, Iran has not responded. I think internationally, diplomatically, there's a concern that Iran is going to misread the situation. Domestically in the United States, there's a concern that President Biden is going to be too soft on Iran. So that sends a very clear signal. And to the United States allies in the region, thinking here specifically Saudi Arabia, President Biden spoke with King Salman of Saudi Arabia last night. Iran was one of the topics, and the language that both sides have used to describe that phone conversation is very tough on Iran. The United States saying it will support Saudi Arabia against attacks from Iranian-affiliated groups. And the Saudis, from their part, believe that the United States is strong in that commitment and that the United States will stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. Remembering, of course, that for this particular important ally, Saudi Arabia, President Trump was very tough on Iran. They liked that. So this tough message on Iran from Biden will resonate, and these actions will resonate as well, diplomatically in Tehran, with allies in the region, and of course domestically back home.